Dean Martin was in the middle of singing That's Amore when a Mafia boss stood up in the front row and made a throat-slitting gesture across his neck. The entire audience fell silent. But what Dean did next turned a death threat into the most legendary moment in Vegas history. It was a Saturday night in November 1965 at the Sands Hotel and Casino, and the Copa Room was packed to capacity with 1,200 of Las Vegas's elite. High rollers, movie stars, politicians, and plenty of people whose money came from sources they'd rather not discuss were all there to see Dean Martin perform his legendary late-night show. Dean was at the height of his Vegas powers. The Rat Pack ruled the Strip, his television show was dominating ratings, and his smooth Italian charm made him the perfect entertainer for a city that thrived on secrets and style. But what nobody in that room knew was that Dean Martin was about to face the most dangerous moment of his career. The man sitting in the front row, booth 7, was Vincent "Vinny the Fish" Torino, one of the most feared mafia bosses on the East Coast. Vinny didn't come to Vegas for entertainment, he came for business, and tonight his business involved sending a very clear message to Dean Martin. To understand why a mafia don would travel 3,000 miles to threaten Dean Martin in front of a room full of witnesses, you have to understand the complicated relationship between entertainers and organized crime in 1960s Las Vegas. Vegas was built by the mob. The casinos, the hotels, the entire infrastructure of the city had been financed and controlled by organized crime families for decades. Most entertainers who worked the Strip understood the unwritten rules. You took their money, you performed in their clubs, and you kept your mouth shut about what you saw. But Dean Martin had always been different. Unlike many performers who were either intimidated by the mob or actively courted their approval, Dean treated the gangsters like he treated everyone else, with casual respect but no special deference. He was friendly but never subservient, charming but never fearful. This attitude had served Dean well for years. His Italian heritage and natural diplomacy helped him navigate the dangerous waters of Vegas without making enemies. But it had also created a problem. Some people in the mob felt that Dean Martin thought he was better than them. Vincent Torino was one of those people. 3 months earlier, Torino had approached Dean through intermediaries with a proposition. Torino's nephew, Tony, was trying to break into the entertainment business as a singer. Tony had some talent, but more importantly, he had Uncle Vinny's money and protection behind him.
The request was simple. Dean should use his influence to get Tony some opening slots at major Vegas venues, maybe introduce him to some record producers, and help establish him as a serious performer. In return, Torino would ensure that Dean's Vegas operations ran smoothly, without any complications. It was the kind of favor that most entertainers would have agreed to without hesitation. Help a connected guy's nephew get some work, and in return, you get the protection and support of one of the most powerful crime families in America. It seemed like a no-brainer. But Dean Martin said no. Not rudely, not dramatically, just no. He told Torino's representatives that he didn't get involved in other people's career decisions, that he believed talent should speak for itself, and that he was sure Tony would make it on his own if he was meant to. It was a perfectly reasonable response, delivered with Dean's characteristic charm and diplomacy, but it was still a rejection, and Vincent Torino was not a man who was accustomed to being told no. For months, Torino had been stewing about Dean's refusal. In his world, when someone with power asked for a favor, you either said yes or you faced the consequences. The idea that Dean Martin, just an entertainer in Torino's mind, would dismiss a request from a man of Torino's stature was an insult that demanded a response. So Torino came to Vegas to deliver that response personally. That night at the Sands, Dean had no idea that Torino was in the audience. He was just doing what he did best, entertaining a room full of people who had paid good money to forget their problems for a few hours. Dean was halfway through his signature song, That's Amore, getting to the part where he always made the audience laugh with his exaggerated Italian accent when he noticed something was wrong. The energy in the room had changed. People were looking uncomfortable, whispering to each other, and several guests near the front tables had suddenly found reasons to visit the bar or the restroom. That's when Dean saw him. Vincent Torino was sitting at the front table, wearing an expensive black suit and staring directly at Dean with cold, dead eyes. Dean recognized him immediately. You didn't work Vegas without knowing the faces of the men who really ran the city. But it wasn't just Torino's presence that sent a chill through the room. It was what he did next. As Dean reached the chorus of That's Amore, Torino slowly stood up. He looked directly at Dean, smiled a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and deliberately drew his finger across his throat in the universal gesture of death. The gesture was unmistakable, and it was meant to be seen. This wasn't a private threat, it was a public humiliation, designed to show everyone in that room that Dean Martin wasn't as untouchable as he thought he was. The Copa room fell dead silent. The band kept playing, but every eye in the place was switching between Dean and Torino, waiting to see what would happen next.
Dean could have done several things in that moment. He could have stopped singing and left the stage, which would have been smart but would have looked like cowardice. He could have ignored the threat and pretended nothing happened, which might have saved face but would have escalated the situation. He could have called for security, which would have turned the Copa room into a battleground. Instead, Dean Martin did something that no one, not the audience, not his band, and definitely not Vincent Torino, expected. He smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a fake smile, but the genuine, warm smile that had made him famous. Then he did something even more unexpected. He dedicated the next verse of That's Amore directly to Torino. "This one's for my friend Vinny," Dean said into the microphone, pointing directly at the Mafia boss, "a man who really knows how to make an impression." The audience didn't know how to react. Was Dean Martin actually addressing a death threat with humor? Was he insane, or was this some kind of performance art? But Dean wasn't done. Instead of being intimidated by Torino's presence, he decided to turn the entire situation into part of his act. "You know, folks," Dean continued, still singing but now talking between verses, "I love it when people are passionate about music. Some people clap, some people sing along, and some people," he looked directly at Torino, "some people really know how to express themselves." The genius of Dean's response was that he was acknowledging Torino's threat without backing down from it, but he was doing it in a way that made Torino look foolish if he escalated things further. How do you threaten a man who's treating your death threat like it's part of the entertainment? Torino found himself in an impossible position. He had come to intimidate Dean Martin, but Dean was turning his intimidation into comedy. If he stormed out, he would look like he couldn't handle a joke. If he tried to make good on his threat in front of 1,200 witnesses, he would create a PR nightmare for the mob at a time when they were trying to keep a low profile in Vegas. And perhaps most importantly, Dean's response was so smoothly done, so perfectly timed, and so genuinely funny that even some of Torino's own associates were struggling not to smile. Dean continued with his set, but he had subtly changed the entire dynamic of the room. Instead of being a victim being threatened by a powerful gangster, he had become a master entertainer dealing with a difficult audience member. It was a complete reversal of power, achieved through nothing but charisma and timing. As the song ended, Dean did something that sealed his legend forever. He looked directly at Torino and said, "Thank you for being such a good sport, Vinny. Next time you want to request a song, just raise your hand like everyone else." The audience erupted in laughter and applause. They still didn't fully understand what had just happened, but they knew they had witnessed something special. Dean Martin had just faced down a Mafia boss with nothing but wit and style. But the most amazing thing happened next. Vincent Torino, the man who had come to Vegas to humiliate Dean Martin, began to smile. Then he began to chuckle, and then, to everyone's absolute amazement, he started applauding.
Torino sat back down, ordered a drink, and stayed for the rest of Dean's set. When it was over, he sent word backstage that he wanted to speak with Dean privately. The meeting that followed has become the stuff of Vegas legend. According to people who were there, Torino told Dean that in 40 years of crime, politics, and business, no one had ever handled him the way Dean had that night. "You got balls," Torino reportedly said. "I came here to teach you respect, and instead, you taught me something about class." What happened next surprised everyone. Instead of carrying out his threat, Torino became one of Dean's biggest protectors in Vegas. The man who had come to intimidate him became his unofficial bodyguard, making sure that no other criminals caused problems for Dean's performances. The story of that night spread through Vegas like wildfire, and then across the country. Dean Martin had faced down one of the most dangerous men in America with nothing but humor and courage, and he had not only survived, but won the gangsters' respect. From that night forward, Dean Martin's status in Las Vegas was unshakable. Word went out through organized crime circles that Dean was off limits, not because he was under anyone's protection, but because he had earned something even more valuable: respect. Years later, when people asked Dean about that night, he would just smile and say, "I've always believed that if you can make someone laugh, they're not thinking about hurting you." But those close to Dean knew there was more to it than that. Dean hadn't just made Torino laugh, he had shown him a different way to handle conflict, a more sophisticated approach than violence and intimidation. Vincent Torino remained a fan of Dean's for the rest of his life. He would often bring associates to Dean's shows, not as a threat, but as a gesture of respect. And whenever anyone suggested causing trouble for Dean Martin, Torino would tell them the story of the night Dean made a fool out of him and somehow turned an enemy into a friend. The incident also changed how other entertainers dealt with similar situations. Dean had shown that it was possible to stand up to organized crime without being disrespectful or reckless. His approach became a template for how to maintain dignity and independence while still navigating the dangerous waters of Vegas in its mob-controlled heyday. Frank Sinatra later said, "Dean didn't just save his own life that night, he probably saved all of ours. He showed these guys that entertainers could be strong without being threatening, independent without being disrespectful." The Mafia boss who came to threaten Dean Martin ended up teaching the entire underworld a lesson about the power of charm, wit, and genuine coolness. Dean proved that sometimes the best way to handle a dangerous situation isn't to fight back or run away, it's to change the rules of the game entirely. Dean Martin's reaction to Vincent Torino's death threat became one of the most legendary moments in Las Vegas history. Proof that true coolness isn't about never being afraid, it's about finding a way to be graceful under pressure, even when your life is on the line. The King of Cool had faced his greatest test and passed with flying colors, turning a potential tragedy into a triumph through nothing but style, wit, and an unshakable belief that humor could overcome even the darkest threats. That night at the Sands, Dean Martin didn't just save his own life, he elevated the art of being cool to a level that no one has matched since.